I would now like to ask the panelists of our opening panel to join me on stage. Now, if you were here last year, you may already be quite familiar with the title of this panel. Our intent is to have it every year as a scene setter in order to not only check in and to receive an update of the current state of climate and security debate, but also to provide a baseline for the rest of the discussions for the 2 days by anchoring them in the latest scientific research and geopolitical developments. And well, on the latter point, I guess some years will be more intense than others. Last year's session was illuminating. It gave us a deeper appreciation for the diversity of perspectives, not only on what climate security even means, but also on how each community approaches it and understands it, and I guess also takes action on it from their unique context. To moderate this year's panel, we are very happy to welcome Ms. Laura Birkman, who is the director of the Climate, Water, Food Security Program at the Hague Center for Strategic Studies. With her extensive experience at the intersection of environmental change and security and her leadership in both scientific research, international policy dialogue, and in facilitating cross-sectoral engagement, Laura is, well, perfectly positioned to guide this panel. She will be joined by experts providing a great diversity of scientific, institutional, policy perspectives. Thanks to all, and Laura, you have the floor.
Wonderful. So good morning, everybody, and welcome to the 2025 Montreal Climate Security Summit. And it's really such a privilege to be opening our discussions with this first panel, The State of Climate Security Today. And a special thanks again to Casco and the CDA Institute for convening this remarkable group of experts and practitioners. And it's really great to have you all here. I know it's not been easy for everybody to come here. So let's begin. What is the state of climate security today? As last year's opening panel underscored, climate change is no longer just a threat multiplier. It is increasingly a direct driver of security risks across geographies and domains. For NATO and its partners, that means adapting strategy, operations, and resilience to face extreme weather, resource competition, migration pressures, and shifting geopolitics. The effects of climate change are worsening everywhere. This past year, my home continent, Europe, offered a stark reminder of how climate impacts are hitting home. In 2024, the Rhine River reached its lowest water levels in decades, disrupting transport and trade. Earlier this year, the Netherlands, my country, faced severe flooding from record rainfall, while in August, southern France endured its largest wildfire in 75 years, burning an area the size of Paris. The Financial Times reported this week that between 2020 and 2023, climate-related damage in Europe caused more financial harm than the entire previous decade, with average losses of 44.5 billion euros per year. These are not distant figures. They're reshaping budgets, infrastructure, and political priorities today. But of course, this is a global reality, and the security implications of climate change are even more acute in regions already under stress. On recent travels of myself to Iraq and Jordan, I saw firsthand how increasing water scarcity, rising heat, and land degradation are stretching state capacity and fueling tensions over natural resources, displacement, and governance. Across Africa, climate volatility intersects with food insecurity and migration, eroding development gains and amplifying instability. The message is clear: impacts are everywhere, and they're accelerating. To complicate matters, geopolitical trends are making global collaboration more difficult. Conflict, rising distrust, fragmentation, and strategic competition are undermining the very cooperation needed to address climate security challenges. In such a fractured environment, new forms of partnership engagement and joint work across science, policy, and defense become essential lifelines. So this is the backdrop of our opening session, and it brings together perspectives from science, policy, regional realities, and alliance strategy to help us understand how the landscape has evolved since last year and what NATO and its partners must do to adapt strategically, operationally, and politically. And we are joined today by three exceptional thinkers on this. We have Dr. Kimberley Miner, research professor at the University of Maine, bridging climate science and strategic foresight. We have Ms. Erin Sikorsky, director of the Center for Climate and Security and of the International Military Council on Climate and Security, examining how climate pressures reshapes defense and alliance strategy and geopolitics. And last but definitely not least, we have Dr. Cromwell Lukorito, vice chair of the IPCC Working Group 2 on Adaptation and lecturer at the University of Nairobi, offering critical insights from Africa on adaptation and resilience. Together, they'll help take stock of where we stand, scientifically, strategically, and regionally, and why the state of climate security is more precarious today than it was a year ago. Today's opening panel will be structured to provide multiple perspectives. So each of our three experts will give brief opening statements, after which we'll engage in a moderated discussion, and of course, we'll open the floor to questions from the audience. So let's begin with Dr. Kimberley Miner. And just briefly, to build on what I mentioned earlier, so Kimberley Miner is a research assistant professor at the University of Maine, where she studies how climate change drives systemic environmental and security risks. Her work focuses on translating complex climate data into actionable intelligence for decision makers, from extreme weather forecasting to emerging threats in the Arctic and cryosphere. Dr. Miner has been a leading voice in connecting climate science with risk assessment and strategic foresight, helping bridge the gap between research and real-world resilience planning. Her recently published book, Considering Climate Change, is aimed at empowering younger generations to plan for climate change. Dr. Miner, you have the floor.
Thanks, Laura. I'm going to stand up for mine. Well, it's such a privilege to be with you all today. As Laura mentioned, I'm here wearing one of my hats on behalf of the University of Maine. There's more about me in my bio if you're interested. So I was trying to decide what to talk about with such a knowledgeable audience, and I decided the best way for us to proceed would be to do particle physics. So get ready, it's 9 a.m. and we're doing particle physics. So this is a Keeling curve. You're all very familiar with it. I actually saw on social media a couple days ago someone that I follow mention that he checks the Keeling curve every morning, which I thought was really interesting, right? Because you see seasonal variation, but obviously you can see kind of a linear trend increasing. And even though we understand that in the longer term scale, when you're considering ice cores, for example, or tree rings, it's a non-linear change in the more recent period, it does kind of feel like a linear change when you're looking at these recent graphs from the 1950s to 1960s moving forward. So let's talk a little bit about what it would mean if things were nonlinear. I can kind of medium see all of my slides, so you'll have to bear with me. So this is called the Lorentz attractor. Margaret Hamilton of NASA fame, Ellen Fetter, and Edward Lorenz developed it for atmospheric science. So basically the idea is that particles are moving through a cloud, and it's really hard to forecast what clouds are going to look like, and so it's very hard to think about what particles are going to look like in the clouds. What they realized and what they developed was that the original parameters of any given situation change the way that the particle moves over time. Did I just lose you guys on my mic? Okay. Change the way that the particle moves over time. So basically you can see that the ball starts in a certain place and it moves, right? And it moves over time as the parameters change. So any given state that the ball starts in will change because of the forcings that happen afterwards. This was the basis for a lot of chaos theory. The butterfly effect was coined that because of this. It wasn't actually because a butterfly lands somewhere and a hurricane happens somewhere else. It was because of the way that this Lorentz attractor looks. So the idea is that nonlinear change can happen in any system, specifically in particle physics, but also in natural systems, right? Remember, this was developed for atmospheric physics to start with, so it's already a natural system that's being driven by forcings that are in a natural system. The parameters change over time, creating nonlinear change. Yes, awesome. So luckily, my colleague Leon Simmons put this out on his social media a couple days ago, and I asked if I could use it to share it with all of you, because I thought that maybe this would be a little bit easier to understand than the Lorentz attractor. So we know that the initial parameters in a system create a changing system over time, right? So as things change, the system will change. So that means that as a stable climate, and I'm going to try to keep this going, bless. Can folks in the back help me keep this animation going as I'm talking? Thank you guys so much. So as it changes from a stable climate, you see that you've got an increase of activation energy, right? Warming temperatures due to gases that are very excitable or very energetic in the atmosphere create an activation energy where you can move from one steady state, let's say the Holocene, where humans are used to living, right? We're pretty comfortable with seasonality. We're pretty comfortable with the temperatures. We've got a couple weird things like the Little Ice Age, but otherwise it's pretty much been very similar climate for most of human history. What happens when you have this huge amount of activation energy is you have the opportunity to move to a new steady state. I'm gonna try to start it one more time. And even though you can see the variations, seasonal or yearly, in the steady state, moving to a new steady state means that your parameters have changed exponentially. We have what we call an abrupt change. We have a nonlinear change. Things in the system have changed so completely that you're finding a new steady state, okay? So it'll look completely different in this schema. It would look completely different than anything that we're used to in human history. A complete departure from what we're used to in the Holocene. This is not a guaranteed. I'm not telling you that this is definitely something that we should be planning for, so everybody buckle up. What I'm saying is that there is an opportunity for abrupt, nonlinear climate change when you have enough activation energy. And look at the amount of activation energy it takes to move to a new normal or to move back. That amount of activation energy is possible, right? Volcanoes exist. We've already put all sorts of energetic gases into the atmosphere, but it's incredibly difficult to change from one steady state to another steady state. So I wanted to share all these theoretical ideas with you today to kind of help us start thinking about what it would be like to talk about nonlinear or abrupt climate change, where we're not necessarily really seeing a little bit of warming, we're not really just going through 1.5 Celsius and things are a little drier and maybe there's rain in some weird places and I don't know, maybe the West Antarctic ice sheet starts to wobble a little bit and crack. We're thinking completely about a new system, about a completely different set of conditions that we're not sure what they would look like, where the initial parameters are, or what it would drive as far as, let's say, tipping points or collapses of the global system. So on that cheery note, I'll pass it over to Erin.
Thanks, Dr. Miner. And well, indeed, it's a stark start to the conversation where nonlinear change is increasingly something that we will have to contend with. Let me briefly introduce our next speaker, Dr. Sikorsky.
Ms.
Sikorsky.
I don't want to take credit for things I don't have.
Ms. Erin Sikorsky is director, as I mentioned, of both the Center for Climate and Security and the IMCCS, the International Military Council on Climate and Security. She leads global efforts to analyze how climate change intersects with defense, politics, geopolitics, and national security strategy. A former U.S. intelligence analyst, Ms. Sikorsky brings deep expertise on how climate impacts shape military readiness, alliance cohesions, and NATO's evolving strategic environment. Her recent work highlights the geopolitical dimensions of climate change and the need for integrated security responses across the transatlantic community. This year, she published Climate Change on the Battlefield, International Military Responses to the Climate Crisis, a new book exploring how militaries are already responding to climate hazards with case studies and assessment of gaps. Ms. Sikorsky, please go ahead.
Great. Thanks so much, Laura. Thanks to the Casco and CDA for having me. It's really a pleasure to be in a room with so many friends and colleagues who work so much on these incredible issues. And it's a pleasure to follow Dr. Miner. I'm not going to talk about particle physics, but she set me up very nicely. We didn't even coordinate to talk about nonlinear change and how we prepare for discontinuities and shocks to the system. You know, as Laura said, I was trained as an intelligence analyst, and so I was always told to give the bottom line up front in any talk that I give, and I'm going to echo what Laura said. I think we're in a really dangerous moment right now for climate security, where frankly the gap between the threat from climate change and our preparedness, our ability to manage it, is actually growing. And I'm going to talk a little more about why I think that is, but first I want to get to this question around linearity and the threats we face. Because I think, you know, for a long time, the way we have approached climate security vis-a-vis militaries is this question of how does climate affect existing military priorities, right? Whether it is competition with China, whether it's an adversary like Russia, countering terrorism, right? It's that threat multiplier model. You layer climate change on top and it makes things worse. And that's a really important way to look at the question, right? Those are real threats and we have to understand them. And I would commend to you, my colleague John Conger has an article this morning in the Montreal Gazette actually about just this, and he talks about the Arctic. And so I think it's important for militaries and the security community to continue to analyze and ask those questions. But as Dr. Miner has laid out, that's not enough, right? Instead, we need to think more and more about how climate change is creating new threats, right? How it is reshaping the security landscape. As I wrote in Climate Change on the Battlefield, you have to quote your own book, right, if you've written one recently, even militaries that take climate change seriously tend to see it as something that merely alters or adds to their existing mission instead of considering the possibility that climate change is fundamentally reshaping or reorienting their core duties. And so I think when you step back and you think about what are militaries for, what are security services for, you look at the NATO mission statement, right? Its essential and enduring purpose is to safeguard the freedom and security of all of its members. And as Laura laid out very nicely, it's undeniable that climate change itself is threatening the security of NATO member states. She gave you some great statistics. I'm going to give you another sobering one from 2022, one of the hottest years on record. Heat waves across Europe and the UK added 20,000 extra deaths that summer in 2022. In all of that year, terrorism accounted for 6,700 deaths globally, right? So climate change was responsible, or at least the heat wave portion of climate change was responsible for almost 3 times more deaths. Yet when you talk to security actors, terrorism is still up here and climate change is increasingly, unfortunately, I think, down there. And so I think it's time for us to maybe be so bold to flip that question that I started with on its head. And instead of just asking how does climate change affect existing military priorities, that we ask how do our current priorities impact our ability to tackle new threats posed by climate change. And I think, as Dr. Miner laid out, right, this question is important because things are only going to get worse and more complicated and less certain, right? We're going to have discontinuities. We're entering a world in which we have no analog. Dr. Josh Busby, who I'm sure many of you are very familiar with, calls this the end of stationarity. It's something that a fellow Canadian, John Valiant, talks about in his book Fire Weather, how the worst thing you've ever experienced is the worst thing you think you will ever experience, right? Humans have a really hard time envisioning future threats that are not like the past. And so as we talk about the reversal of the AMOC potentially, right, the melting of the Greenland ice sheet or the Antarctic, the collapse of multiple breadbaskets simultaneously, right? This is the game in decades to come, and one that security actors need to be prepared for. However, I think at a time when this threat picture is becoming more clear, we're seeing it become harder for security and military institutions to be bold in how they address it. And that's been reflected in many of the remarks earlier today. I think it's hard to meet this moment. And as I've watched over the past year, we don't have to talk about the United States right now, although we can, or maybe over a drink later. There are other, though, signs that make me worried. The fact that climate change was not uttered at the NATO summit or in the public forum. I understand why that was, but I think, frankly, it's a mistake. The fact that, it was reported this spring in Politico that an unnamed EU official, when asked, was laughed about Spain's proposition that investments in climate adaptation and disaster response could count as defense spending, right? That was not considered legitimate by some in the EU. And when militaries, whether it's here in Canada or in the United States or in Australia, who have spent more person hours fighting wildfires than ever before, are still operating as though that response is something extra, right? It's not their core duty, and so they're constantly reacting to what's happening instead of being proactive. So, I think you get my point, right? I think my worry is that amidst this challenging geopolitical moment we're in, where states are turning inward, nationalism is rising, trust is faltering, many countries are reverting to focusing on more traditional state-level threats, right? That climate's seen as something, well, we'll get to that later, or it's not as an urgent threat, when really it's becoming more urgent than ever before. So this creates a blind spot and puts countries at risk. It also misses a huge opportunity to gain advantages and to gain, kind of buy one, get one free, no regrets investments in resilience and adaptation that help against a whole host of things. I think I'll stop there, but I'm hoping we can talk more about hybrid threats and other ways in which the geopolitical environment is integrating here. So thanks, Laura.
Thanks, Erin, and thanks for presenting this bottom line, which, doesn't make the picture any happier, I'm afraid, this morning. However, we would be remiss not to really bring in what is happening at the regional level. And I think that this is where our third speaker really can bring in some deeper insights into what it means, to encounter those severe climate-related impacts and how it actually is affecting societal dynamics. And it's a real privilege to welcome Dr. Cromwell Lukorito, who's Vice Chair of the IPCC Working Group 2 on Impacts, Adaptation and Vulnerability, and lecturer in Earth and Climate Sciences at the University of Nairobi. Dr. Lukorito's research explores how climate change shapes security, livelihoods, and resilience across Africa, and has advised the African Union and the UNEP on climate adaptation and environmental security, contributed to multiple IPCC assessment reports. And with a focus on locally driven solutions and equitable approaches to global climate governments, I think he brings a vital regional perspective to today's discussion on the front lines of climate and security. Dr. Lukorito, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Laura, and good morning, Excellencies, good morning, colleagues. Happy to be in this summit for the first time. I'm disadvantaged in the sense that I don't have a history to refer to. However, I feel there's quite a lot that we can engage. Much appreciated the invitation from CASCO and our other partner institution to this important summit, seeking to look into this complex, I call it complex, issue around climate security. It being one of the spin-offs of a cascade of climate change impacts following the growing risks that we are experiencing globally, of course, in a manner that is differentiated. We have certain geographies that are highly impacted than others. And my African continent, to start with, becomes one such. So when I had the invitation, I was wondering what we bring on board in the NATO space. But I just recollected that the cascade of a climate impacts that culminates in conflicts instabilities of our states, as well as forced migration, when the limits, the tolerance limits within our continental borders, our national borders, spills over to even enhance the risk level of some of our Africa's inhabitants attempting to get to what is perceived to be a safer ground within Europe. Yes, struggling to find their way across the Mediterranean to get into Spain and otherwise. So I got that connection that yes, I think it's relevant for us to come and share perspectives on why people desperately take on that risk to swim across the Mediterranean to find a safer place to patch. Your Excellencies, today, of course, humanity faces a global and interconnected threats and the challenges that are associated with the adverse effects of climate change. Here we are not just looking at impacts, we are looking at the adverse end because that is what triggers change in location, not into an area of emptiness, but into an occupied territory, bringing therefore elements of conflicts over the space, over the cultures, over the resources which are never limitless, they are scarce, among others. And I would like to concur with the earlier speakers that climate change acts not only as a driver, but a threat multiplier as well. But as that occurs, we see it intensifying existing social, economic, and environmental vulnerabilities, triggering conflicts and significantly altering the global geopolitics that is now the password of this century. And therefore, we see a direct nexus between climate and conflict. A nexus in the sense that a feedback loop exists where climate change leads to conflict, which in turn weakens institutions and hinders effective climate action. Because any responses to the climate signal, either by emissions reduction and removals, what we call mitigation, and adaptation on the other side, focusing to tackle the risks thereof, reducing the vulnerabilities, enhancing the capacities to respond to the adversity is indeed an issue. On the other hand, we see conflict destroying infrastructure, disrupting livelihoods, and diverting resources, leaving the affected communities even more vulnerable to future, because we are talking about today, but where we are going to in the future is what to be worried most. And I believe that's why we must be here to think together and see how do we navigate this fluidity around the climate security. And in so doing, Africa is not an exception. It is going through the same challenges of its own share. It may not be the magnitude of what the NATO is going through, but we have our own share back at home of the adversity from the climate change. And we know that despite contributing less than about 4% of the global greenhouse gas emissions, which are indeed the fuel of the change, Africa is one of the most affected continents by climate change impacts, and some of these impacts are inflicting conflicts, insecurity, instability across countries within the region. We are battling within intra-country a kind of conflicts as well as inter-country a kind of conflicts, inter-regional economic blocks within Africa also being at a conflict simply because of these adverse effects of climate change, imposing a lot of risks from notably the climate primary risks of drought, which alternates with flooding. And in the recent past, we are seeing an add-on of the heat waves, let alone the tropical cyclones within oceanic systems, as well as convective storms over the continental land masses. So we see a myriad then of risks which are compounding to further deepen the vulnerability of the continent. And the change is escalating conflicts in the continent. And that's why now Europe becomes a haven for the African. When their coping capacities are exceeded, they are desperately looking into the near neighborhood for a future. And that's why we see now the out-migration from the continent being on an increase. We see these conflicts notably arising from resource scarcity, because we see water in particular, we see pasture in particular, adding together to become the basis of the resource-based conflicts, because the livelihoods and the economies of the continent largely depends on Mother Nature. So any disruption then within the natural resources will actually introduce perturbations within the continent. We see economic, therefore, and livelihood disruptions being the order of the day. And when livelihoods are challenged, when economic dependencies are challenged, then humanity is forced to move. Right? And they're not moving alone. They are moving with their stocks in the near distance. And therefore, we see a case where the resource-based conflicts over water and pasture, especially for the pastoral systems, which are the dominant livelihood dependencies in the arid and semi-arid portions of Africa, which indeed occupy about 2/3 of the continent. We see weakened governance. We see ethnic and social tensions also coming into play. And therefore, out of that spins off the key climate-driven security risks having to do with intensified resource competition, livelihood and food insecurity, forced migration and displacements, exploitation of armed groups who take advantage to recruit and entrench themselves, presenting a direct risk that requires, in most cases, military interventions like yourselves, because the issue now goes beyond national borders. And therefore, the military of the neighboring countries then have to take up the challenge. So we see, therefore, that there are regional vulnerabilities associated with the adverse impacts of climate change. But what's important is that the vulnerabilities upon Africa are differentiated. They are not spatially uniform. Each sub-region of Africa has its own rightful share of the vulnerability and therefore of the risk levels that they have to battle with. When you look at the Sahel, when you look at the Lake Chad Basin, when you look at the Horn of Africa, the Eastern and Southern Africa, they have their own challenges, but which all converge into conflicts, instabilities, and requiring some military interventions in some cases. But that does not mean that nothing is happening. We see an endeavor of efforts being made here to make sure that the continent communities live with a change. And efforts are underway to put into a disturbed system some elements of what I keep calling shock absorbers into a system, so that they can be able to absorb the what? The climate shocks. The success of it is, of course, not assured, but something is happening, because we rather do something in a narrative manner pointing towards a success than doing nothing. And therefore, the adaptation to climate security risk in Africa is therefore anchored mainly around integrated strategies focusing on agricultural resilience, because the continent is heavily dependent on agriculture for economic growth as well as for community livelihoods. We are also looking at natural resources around water and pasture management, as well as governance improvements. So in agriculture, of course, practices and technologies that are anchored around increasing productivity, sustaining the productivity, and also doing something about the drivers of the change, and also managing the risk part, which we are looking at it from agriculture as climate smart, and also employing some integrated resource management issues, early warning systems investments, so that we can be able to anticipate and prepare and plan for the impending unseen future for us to be able to take care of that. We are looking at Mother Nature as the provisioning system. And therefore, all interventions that we are making to adapt to the adverse impacts of climate change are based on nature products, right? So Laura, I see you looking at me, meaning that you want me to stop, but I want to say that much as that is happening, there are challenges. There are also opportunities which have not been exploited. And that's why within the climate change, I don't want us to be bogged down with the negative impacts. We want to look much more on the positive side. What opportunities are there, and what can we do to unlock them so that we can be able to do this? So financing, of course, a major challenge. Ineffective governance systems, poor coordination between government agencies, and so on become important. The base poverty and weak governance, the fragmented or siloed a sort of approaches to adaptation are also a barrier. We have limited climate data infrastructure, of course, presenting a hurdle, and reliance majorly on external top-down frameworks, of course, overlooking the indigenous and the local knowledge systems, which I have always advocated are the basis for adaptation, because we can pick up from there, knowing very well what works and how, instead of trying to venture into new frontiers on experimental basis when we cannot have time to experiment on life. Opportunities, on the other hand, are also there, because we have a chance for Africa to leverage its rich renewable energy potential that could be instrumental in leapfrogging polluting energy sources. The continent also has a wealth of indigenous knowledge, which can be, of course, promoted, and the young African population also is an opportunity, which we can see how we can engage them for meaningful use. And also, we see that all these things are important. Capacity building or enhancement.
I want to save a few of your, because there's such deep insight, but I want to save a few of your remarks also for the discussion, because I think.
All right. Yes, I'm just
address those.
now winding up so that we get to that level. We see that besides that, we also have a lot of capacity building initiatives which are underway to make sure that we unlock the potentials that we have within the region, looking at it also through some equity lens, so that we can be able to see that what we are actually trying to look at as interventions have a justice lens. Otherwise, we have a lot of compromise on the basic human right in some of the interventions that we are making, the technologies that we are deploying. Therefore, looking at this level of vulnerability it's important then for us to know that as the global level also, as the NATO even community considers their security measures, please remember that some of the inflows from that part of the world are inevitable. Thank you, Laura.
Thank you. No, thank you so much, Dr. Lukorito, because I mean, I had to stop you now, but I think actually setting this regional perspective is a critical aspect of this summit, because those dynamics are so, I think, create such an important learning ground for all of us to understand how context-specific these issues are. You indicated how the feedback loop between climate change and conflict, how it interacts, and very detailed in how those interventions actually that we seek to develop or to adapt to are also put under constant pressure, because those dynamics between climate-related events and security consequences are also under continuous pressure. And at the same time, there's a lot going on to try and dampen some of those impacts. So I think there's a deep learning environment for all of us. So thanks again with that. And well, now I actually want to open these statements to a broader discussion, and I want to circle back actually, first of all, to the evolving landscape and what's different now vis-a-vis, well, a few years back, but specifically what do we notice since last year is developing. And Dr. Miner, if I may start with you, what climate change impacts have accelerated? Which tipping points are appearing sooner than expected? Can you say a few more words about that?
Sure. Thanks, Laura. And thanks, everyone, for your remarks. So all models are wrong, right? And some models are useful. And I think that when folks started modeling the impacts of climate change, we had this 2100 mark in mind, which has proven to be more or less incorrect in that the changes are happening much sooner than we were anticipating. I think in some of the cases with tipping points, so when we're thinking about AMOC, the Atlantic overturning circulation shutdown, we're thinking about ice sheet collapse, we're thinking about change from temperate forests or from the boreal forest, and the change in productivity, about whether or not plants are able to absorb the amount of CO2 that's in the atmosphere. I think we're not totally sure when those tipping points will be breached, right? And I think myself and others always end our peer-reviewed publications by saying, let's just not test the system. Let's not run this experiment. That's the safest way to go. So I think what we are seeing is year over year is this nonlinear change, right? Which is why I think we're discussing it today. You are seeing it at the regional level, different in each country, whether it's very, very warm falls or rain instead of snow. These very specific location-based changes that are not necessarily 100% attributed to climate change, right? The science of attribution, which I don't ever get into, but there's lots of very smart people working on. But I do think that we are potentially seeing collapses of natural systems that are important for stability globally, right? Without these natural systems functioning, without the mid-latitude forests, the boreal forests, even the ice sheets continuing to function or grow or have a static state, we are totally unclear what could happen globally on the longer term. Sea level might rise. Okay, but then what are the knock-on consequences of that? What are the knock-on consequences of a low saline system, for example, when all the ice melts? So lots to discuss there, but I think that unfortunately we're very obviously and very often thinking about unknown unknowns. And now that it's year-to-year impacts, still very difficult to attribute to larger scale system shifts, but noticeable.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Miner. And Ms. Sikorsky, from a military perspective and a geopolitical perspective, how does NATO integrate these accelerating trends, climate trends, at this point into its planning? What are the sort of developments there in terms of framing climate as a core strategic concern?
Yeah, no, thanks, Laura. And I really appreciate listening to my fellow panelists. I just want to comment on one thing that Dr. Miner was talking about these unknown unknowns. And I think sometimes in the security community, we treat those unknowns in climate differently than we treat unknowns in other topics. When I was an intelligence officer, right, we made assessments all the time of what foreign adversaries were going to do based on very little information, right? But we still planned for the worst case scenario of something, and no one would suggest that you shouldn't prepare for the potential worst case terrorist attack, right? But yet with climate, we sometimes say, well, since it's unknown or uncertain, we can't act. And I think that we need to shift that mental model. So that's one thing I think NATO militaries can do in terms of how we approach this, preparing for the worst. But the thing that I've been kind of obsessed with over the past couple of years is just this intersection between climate and hybrid threats, because I think that when I was at the NATO summit in June, that was the word on every defense minister's lips, right, when they were speaking on panels, was worries about gray zone attacks to critical infrastructure, to domestic food security within Europe, about disinformation campaigns they're seeing from Russia and from China. And I think we're seeing time and again how climate-driven hazards are making that space for hybrid threats broader, right? They're exposing a ripe hybrid attack surface, if you will, for NATO to contend with. I mean, you've got preoccupied military and emergency responders, right, in the face of climate hazards, the hundreds of forces that are deploying in response. You've got strained critical infrastructure due to climate change. Summer heat waves increased Europe's electricity demand by 14% and doubled energy prices. If I were sitting in Moscow, I would absolutely be thinking about how I take advantage of that. And then you also have public frustration as well. You had populations in Southern Europe in particular who were incredibly frustrated with the response of governments to climate hazards, to the point where they were calling for governments to step down. And you absolutely, again, see disinformation campaigns, right, from Russia and elsewhere, again, trying to take advantage of that. So when I think about the future and where NATO needs to focus, I think this hybrid threat environment and understanding that building resilience to climate change helps you build resilience then to that hybrid space is critically important and needs to be a greater part of the conversation, and why I think it's so concerning that it's, climate seems to be regulated to the back burner.
Thank you so much, Erin. And Dr. Lukorito, perhaps I can ask you to reflect, because you already, I think, presented a very, comprehensive and spot-on analysis of the relevance of regional dynamics for NATO and alliance members. But perhaps you could build on that, in terms of how you think regional realities could translate into insights that NATO could actually use in terms of, preparing itself better on this climate security challenge that it should address.
Thanks a lot, Laura. I think there's quite a lot to learn from these regional perspectives, because what is happening today at any one part of the world is a potential manifestation for future to other locations, because of the climate signal, which is not manifesting in the same way today, but has potential to manifest going into the future. So when we look at this issue of heightened population dynamics into new geographies, in itself is fertile ground for us to pick a lesson on how we are meant to prepare for this kind of uprisings, because we know that the climate risks are not localized. They are actually cascading across various pathways through either supply chains, finance flows, and so on, which means it is not just about the initial point of landing, but it's about how interconnected the world is. We have a lot of flows, trade and commodity flows, which are actually flowing globally, and therefore the experiences in the management of those flows are actually very, very important. And what to me sounds much more critical is the fact that we don't look at the primary level impacts of the change, but we look at the cascade, the secondary and higher level impacts, which then bring us in this particular space.
Thank you so much. I think that's an excellent point. There's been so much discussion around, how climate change relates to conflict or relates to security, and we all have also a sense that it never, it's not just a straight line. It goes through social, economic, and political pathways to create dynamics that can make things, so much worse. And so by actually understanding those dynamics and those intersections in the middle, those intervening factors, it could be a very important step for NATO, for the alliance members, to better understand how those secondary sort of factors are relevant to operations. So perhaps one more question for this discussion, given some limitations on our time. If perhaps I can mention this to all of you, and then we'll invite the audience to weigh in. We're talking about current and future risks and stress testing NATO. How could we think about, climate change as reshaping NATO's strategic environment? Perhaps we can just say each a few words on what are those key aspects that would need to be taken into considerations in the next years. Perhaps I can start, with Dr. Miner on that.
Sure. There were a couple things that Dr. Lukorito just said that I thought were very interesting and salient to your point. This idea of regional change being almost a proxy or a precursor for regional change somewhere else. I think that's a very interesting idea. It means that we could potentially learn in real time, right? So even if we're not sure what the changes would be over time, or we're concerned about a chaotic or nonlinear system, that does mean that we have adaptation mechanisms presented to us. So I thought that was very helpful. I think we have the opportunity to do a lot of stress testing in real time. I think we've seen that in this year for a variety of circumstances and a variety of dynamics that have emerged. And I do think that there is a growing conversation and maybe a growing opportunity to envision how we want to respond to emerging threats. I do also think that Ms. Sikorsky's point about the emerging environment not necessarily being a threat multiplier, but being the stage is really important for us to think about over the next couple days. If this becomes our operating theater, then what does that mean for planning? What does it mean for the risk to life and livelihood? And what does it mean for the stability of governments, right? Are we going to be making things worse because of our actions because we're concerned about what's happening in the environment? So hopefully that touches a little bit on it, Laura, but I'm looking forward to the discussion with the audience.
Yep. No, I want to build on that previous question and make it more specific, because it relates to a few of the audience's questions, and I'm going to combine a few here. Perhaps I can move this to Erin. How would you communicate strategic risk to leaders who see climate as a distraction from military missions and prioritize tactical concerns?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think there are lots of opportunities. I do think this is where the threat multiplier framework can be helpful as a starting point for skeptical audiences. You're not giving them something else to worry about, but instead showing how climate affects something they're already worried about. But I also think it's important to talk about the strategic opportunities as well, not just the risks, that the countries and the militaries that are best prepared to manage climate hazards or to understand how climate hazards will intersect are the ones that will have strategic advantage. I think that can be a very powerful framing as well, and there's a lot to talk about there. There's a great new report from JP Morgan, actually, that looks at the changing energy landscape and how the geopolitics of energy are offering strategic opportunities with renewables and critical minerals and in different ways than ever before. And I think that opportunity framework, which I know I struggle with as a former intelligence officer who's trained to see all the risks in the world, but I think that is another way to open a conversation.
Thank you. And I think, Dr. Lukorito, you mentioned as well, right, that opportunities are really, the way forward in terms of really gaining more traction on those discussions with at the regional level as well. If you look at, so this question is for Dr. Lukorito. In light of drought driving conflict across the African continent, would arms embargoes on countries like the UAE be an effective climate change strategy? So this is quite a specific question. How would you look at that because of that link with, I suppose, weapons and the spread of weapons on the continent?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question, and I think it fits in very well with what I alluded to much earlier about climate change creating an enabling environment for such illicit flows of weaponry, bordering on arming available human resource who are desperate because of being pushed to the corner because of the adverse impacts of climate change, becoming therefore highly vulnerable to manipulation, because at the end of it all, it's about survival. Yeah? And therefore, when these happen in an environment where we also see a lot of competition for the critical minerals, especially from exploited a continent like Africa, then we begin having pathways for inroad of arms, right, into that particular space, simply because the locals will want to say we need them for self-defense. But then it goes beyond self-defense. It now becomes an aggression, yeah, to the neighboring countries, and therefore bringing a lot of volatility within the region. So the issues of arms, I think, is finding its way there because of the increasing number of militia groups. Look at these other groupings, the Al-Shabaab, for example, in the Greater Horn of Africa, and so on, the Boko Haram in the western part of Africa, etc. We are not manufacturing arms. But these arms somehow are finding their way in the continent. Why? There must be, therefore, a weaker point that then catalyzes the inflow of those illicit arms into our territories. And that can happen also even within the NATO space. Because if some degree of vulnerability can actually go beyond a certain level, then the issue of desperation naturally sets in. And you can try to align with whoever you think can actually guarantee the next breath, even if it is not the best way to go, just for the sake of extending a life. And that's why we have a lot to learn from the regions. And coupled with the science that we have, then we can try to see how an organization like NATO could use this as the current learning lab. What you've observed, rightfully, could serve as a learning lab, especially for the NATO. Whatever the mistakes that have been made can still be avoided in this particular region. And I say this because when we are talking about climate change, we are talking about warming temperature. And the atmosphere and the surface are coupled. And what I have in mind is our collapsing ice seas, blocks. What are we saying? We are now creating pathways where they never existed. And that exposes, especially the NATO region, it's now getting exposed. There are areas which were no go zone because of the ice blocks. But with the climate change, the ice blocks are melting, are collapsing so fast, meaning that a vessel can still navigate through that space, isn't it? And your standard security setup may not have been prioritizing those kinds of what? Of issues. What happens? I'm not saying it's going to happen, but as a scientist, I'm open to think. Yeah, it's a possibility that then we are opening new routes in places where the routes were never there. And these routes could still be exploited by aggressors in whichever way that is perceived to serve their interest. And therefore, what we are learning today is very important for strategizing going into the future.
Thank you, Dr. Lukorito. And just to bring in, because there will be a lot of topics discussed over the next days, but to bring in also here that idea around solutions and around new ways of thinking on these very complicated issues. I'll revert back to Dr. Miner. What do you think the role of AI can be in both as a solution and an opportunity? And then I will immediately provide the follow-up question to Dr. Sikorsky. How can geoengineering, in that respect, also be considered, given, well, the obvious ethical challenges that are in existence there? Can you see some options there? Please go ahead. Small questions, I know.
Yeah, thanks. AI presents a lot of externalities that are presented as internal to the system. So data centers, for example, using a huge amount of power, a huge amount of water, and it's not something, at least in the States, that has been discussed as an option, right? No one's voting on whether or not they should have the water and electricity that they used to use absorbed by a data center. And that's a significant issue with AI. I understand you asked me about opportunities, so I will get there. AI is our most recent wrench, and it can be used really well for some things. There are scientific applications. A number of my teams use AI to incorporate, for example, satellite imagery, airborne imagery, and in situ imagery all in the same place, synthesize it with model data, and try to get an understanding of areas that maybe we can't go. Maybe we can't go anymore. Maybe it's hard to get there. We've also used it recently to identify specific grass species in a grass field. So it could potentially be very cool to use AI or machine learning, deep learning for science. I personally feel like that's a little bit different than asking for a shopping list. So I do think that these are very different conversations, right? Using a large language model for day-to-day tasks, for psychological advice, for shopping is very different than using a machine learning, neurolinguistic programming, deep learning model to understand the dynamics of global change that it's hard to understand otherwise. So I think I'll leave it there. Again, because you asked about opportunities. But I do think that this is we're very much on a knife edge with this technology. And it is a great wrench. We just need to make sure we're applying it to the right size bolt, and we're not just using wrenches to clean our windshields.
Thanks, Dr. Miner.
Well, maybe my first answer on geoengineering is you should all come to the workshop this afternoon when we're discuss this in more detail. But no, I mean, look, so solar geoengineering, the effort to potentially reflect sunlight, right, to cool the planet, to deal with the climate change that is already here, and even if you cut all emissions tomorrow, we'd still be facing these challenges. I look at it from a national security perspective, right? Just as we look at all responses to climate change, the energy transition itself, transition to renewables, something I think we all agree needs to be done even more quickly. It comes with security externalities, security challenges that need to be understood and managed and addressed. I think it's similar with climate intervention technologies and solar geoengineering. You need to understand how this fits into the competitive national security environment we find ourselves in, how things I talked about earlier, disinformation, right, geopolitics, might affect it. But I don't think it's something we shouldn't talk about at all or put our heads in the sand about, because clearly there is increasing interest, there's increasing research funding in this space. And again, from a security perspective, being prepared in case another actor chooses to deploy such technologies or pushes to deploy them, we need to be ready. And we also need to think about it, I think, in a what I would call kind of a risk versus risk mindset as well. Climate change itself poses significant security risks. So when you're evaluating the security risks of responses to climate change, you need to hold those two things in your mind and be able to compare them. But there's a lot, I think, of work to be done there, including just on basic education about what these technologies are and how they might work and how they don't.
Thank you, Erin. And mindful of the time, I will leave this discussion here for now, but of course we will be entering into many more conversations the next 2 days. One message is clear: climate change is reshaping security everywhere. We see that at the regional level, it's driving displacement, conflict, food insecurity, but also in Europe, it is rapidly emerging as a risk to infrastructure, economies, societal stability. The scale and immediacy may differ in regions, but the challenge is absolutely global, and the pathways are really emerging in all kinds of different contexts, and we need to understand what those pathways are, as all our three speakers have underscored. It is important that we think about actions on multiple fronts: strategic foresight, operational adaptation, political coordination, early warning systems, data-driven decision-making, cross-regional collaboration. They're no longer optional, but they are essential. So all this really connects us to the agenda here for the next 2 days, where we're looking to strengthen international collaboration, bridge science and policy, integrate climate into defense and security planning, and also critically understand better what's happening at the regional level so that we inform about the relevance of those plans and operations moving forward. I encourage everyone here to carry these lessons into the rest of the summit, engage with each other, explore solutions, and work across sectors and borders. And let's see how far we can get to bring the discussions forward and actually act on them more effectively in the next year. So thank you very much for